A little light on over here. Make that a little bit better. There we go. And that's it. So I just wanted to play this morning. I got to kind of finish up this Thanksgiving week. There we go. Finish up the Thanksgiving week with, the Pilgrims again. Doing that whole thing. But thought about, going back to Lincoln and his announcement of it. But, since we were looking at this thing from different points of view, the idea of Thanksgiving, getting together with the family, that side of it's nice. The idea of Thanksgiving or Day of Mourning, if you're looking at it from the Native Americans, the indigenous Americans, the Indians, their point of view and how they've perceived this. But I want to go back to the other side of it too. It's the Pilgrims, but not the why they moved. I mean, we've learned a little bit more about that. Why they moved, why they decided to take on this massive, massive shift in what they were doing. They were looking for religious freedom, so they came this way. They figured out how to finance the trip by having entrepreneurs behind it. Although they were all entrepreneurs, I think, in that mindset respect with coming over to America, because the challenges were unbelievable. And the financiers that were behind it, some of the others that were just looking for something different, So it would have been really interesting to interview those folks on the Mayflower that really came over here and what their whys were, because it had to be unbelievably strong. I mean, could you imagine? It's like you just had to get out of that country, had to get out of their country of origin, just because they were being persecuted from a religious standpoint. And they were willing to do anything, including getting on this ship and then going out in the ocean. Well, you'll learn in here is that many of them have even seen the ocean before. Yeah, they've seen water, absolutely, that kind of thing. But to go out in the ocean and go travel for how many days, weeks, months? The risks, because there's no engine. It's a sailboat, and not a big one at that one either. And what it was like to go across the ocean. Well, we're gonna play this video, and hopefully that'll give you a little bit of a better idea as to what it was like, and what they had to endure in order to do this. It's pretty interesting. It's an older video. It's not that old, but it is something that'll bring us back a little bit and see what it was like for those folks that were that took all kinds of chances over here. Let's go full screen. They took all kinds of chances. This way they could do what it is that they felt it was necessary for them to do. And I'll leave you one thought. This is about a 30-minute video here, so I'll play the whole thing through. But I'll leave you with one thought before I go is, what would you do? We sit here, we talk about making changes and the rest of that stuff. And for many of us, it's probably minor changes in the scheme of things. But what's holding us back? What pushed them forward? Maybe that'll be the big Thanksgiving over here. Things to be thankful for. A little clarity as to what we really should be doing and what it is that we're willing to do in order to get to that point. Here's a tour of the Mayflower. This was done back in 2011 while the ship was in dry dock, and I hope you find it interesting.
Mayflower is an immigrant story, and many people in this country have come here across the ocean to a place they're not sure where they're going to a life that they're not sure what it's going to be like. And that's the Mayflower story, and it touches many people all over the world.
The Mayflower II, an authentic 1950s replica of the original Pilgrim ship, was in dry dock in January of 2011. It was at Fairhaven Shipyard for a routine inspection, maintenance, and some restoration work. On this very frigid January day, Mayor Scott Lang visited the ship and got a personal tour from Peter Arenstam, a manager at Plymouth Plantation.
Tell us about how they equipped the Mayflower to make sure you could get from England to the new land and not be in danger.
For many of the passengers, even seeing the ocean, this was a new experience for them, something that they had no experience of and really didn't understand what they were undertaking to cross the ocean, as you said, in a very difficult time of year and with very limited resources bringing with them. And Mayflower was a high-tech object for its time, the way the space capsules are now. A ship in the 17th century was a very complex machine that required trained, skilled operators, sailors, and masters to navigate safely across the ocean.
How big was the Mayflower?
Well, Mayflower in the time period was referred to as a vessel of 180 tons. Now, a ton is a barrel size. It's about 4 or 5 feet tall, and it carries 255 gallons, a ton does. So Mayflower was a vessel that could hold 180 of those tons. But in feet dimension, Mayflower is about 106 feet long, 25 feet wide, and has a draft or draws about 13 feet of water.
I see. And an all sail. That's how it was powered.
Correct. Yeah, she was a fully rigged ship of the time. 6 sails, all square except for the mizzen, which is a fore and aft sail, and a complex web of rigging to control all the sails.
What's interesting, and I don't know that I realized this before, but the Mayflower was a cargo ship.
Yeah, that's right. Mayflower's entire life, she was a merchant ship. Built and carried goods from place to place in England and over to Europe. And only later in her life, at the near end of her life, did she carry passengers that one time from England to the New World. Yeah, there were no passenger ships per se at the time. When the Pilgrims were immigrating to the New World, they had to look for a way to get there, obviously. And the obvious choice was a merchant ship. A merchant ship could carry goods in her cargo deck, and the passengers were the goods that the ship was carrying this particular time. In the same way that they would pack barrels or bundles onto the ship, they packed the passengers onto the Mayflower.
I see.
Making cabins as best they could and putting them into space as best they could.
So you didn't have the option of the Carnival cruise line?
Hardly, no.
All right. So let's talk about this deck. My understanding is right now we're on the mid deck of the Mayflower. So tell us about this particular space.
So this is essentially the cargo deck of Mayflower II. It's essentially a wide open space that the 102 passengers would have lived on during the crossing. As you may know, there were 2 ships destined to that were designed to come to the New World, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The Speedwell proved unseaworthy, and they put as many of the passengers from the Speedwell onto the Mayflower, making conditions even more crowded, along with all their goods. And so those 102 left on the Mayflower, finding room wherever they could. This space that we're in, as you mentioned, is the gun room. It's a space where probably the gunner, who was a part of the crew, and the gunner's mate might have lived, along with the guns that they used to fire out the stern. As a merchant ship, they were very concerned with piracy in the 17th century and had guns on Mayflower to protect themselves.
Now, guns, you mean cannons?
Cannons,
And what was the range of those cannons?
Well, cannon like that we have on Mayflower could probably fire 1 or 2 miles in the right conditions.
So what you would do is you'd spot a ship that you felt was not a friendly ship. Mm-hmm. You would turn and begin to move away from the ship. And at the same time, you would have the ability to repel the ship by firing your cannons.
That was the first choice of a merchant ship, was to get away from those pirates. Pirates generally could overpower a merchant ship. So the merchant ship would try to flee and fire its stern chasers, the guns out the gun doors, the stern gun doors, and keep that pirate ship at bay.
I see. And then a lot of this had to do with the range of the cannons, I'm sure.
Right. But fortunately for the Mayflower crossing, piracy was not, there were no problems with piracy for this Mayflower crossing. One reason we think is that they took a northerly route. They went from England north by Iceland, Greenland, and down Newfoundland to America. to stay away from the pirates that were generally in the southern part of the
a little colder, taking
a little colder, right? And obviously a very stormy crossing, as the little bit that we do know indicates. And Bradford mentions there was only about a week of fair weather. Then there was one storm after the other.
How long did it take them to make their crossing?
Well, the voyage itself was 66 days, but many of the passengers came on board, and they left in September. Beginning of September, but many passengers came on the ship in London in July, went down to Southampton where they were meeting that second ship, the Speedwell. Both ships departed. As I mentioned, there was trouble with the Speedwell twice. They put in once in Dartmouth, then again in Plymouth, England, and finally left England in September of 1620. Mayflower landed in Provincetown in November, but then took a month to look for a place to actual settlement location, and didn't get into Plymouth until December of 1620. So many passengers were living on board for over 6 months.
I see.
And then spent the entire winter on the Mayflower.
What was a typical day like for a passenger? If you weren't a crew member, what was your day like?
It was a one long day of probably tedium, because it was so crowded, because there was so much stuff on board. People probably weren't wandering around a lot. They weren't up on deck very much because it was such a stormy crossing. They probably, and a lot of them probably didn't feel very well for a lot of the voyage, because it was so alien to them, the sea life. So they spent a lot of their time maybe reading, if they could read, singing psalms, sleeping.
So Peter, I know above you talked to me about the tiller, and we're going to see that again in a few minutes. But what do we have here? What is this mechanism?
Well, this is the steering mechanism. This is the way the ship was controlled and steered. The bottom half, as you mentioned, is the whipstaff. The upper part is up in the steerage cabin. The lower part here of the lever helps move the tiller back and forth. It's a very simple but effective method of steering. One of the drawbacks is the higher you go, the farther you have to pull that lever over to get the ship to steer. So they try to keep the whipstaff short on the deck just above, but by doing that, you're not able to see very well for forward. So you have to rely on commands from the master on the next deck up.
There's no power on the replica Mayflower.
No, we have a generator to run the lights and our electric pumps and things like that, but there's no propulsion, mechanical propulsion for the Mayflower. We are towed out of the harbor by our tug. We've used Jaguar here in Fairhaven for years and years, and Charlie Mitchell, comes up to Plymouth and tows us out to Cape Cod, and we sail out in open water.
And we know the Mitchells very well. They do a great job. That's a great tow company. These block and tackle here. This, as I understand it, provides some extra strength if you need to really move that rudder.
We call these the relieving tackles because they help relieve the strain that the helmsman is on by holding that whipstaff by himself. In a stormy situation, particularly with a falling sea, that rudder is going to get banged back and forth, and it's more difficult to hold on with just that. So you have these tackles that the sailors can help control the motion of the tiller.
I see, and basically they'd use their own arm strength, to hold the rudder in place.
Right, exactly.
Peter, tell me, what am I sitting on right now?
These are what we call cabins, not like the cruise line, Carnival Line cabin that we all know today, but this is a small space. It gives a little measure of privacy. There probably was a bedding of straw, in canvas, and pillows and blankets and things, but it's essentially a place to sleep.
A curtain?
Probably a curtain for a little privacy and to keep the heat in, keep the warmth in.
And this would be mine if I had booked it.
Well, you'd probably have to either make it yourself or get the ship's carpenter to make it for you. As we said, this was an open cargo deck, and these cabins were not part of this Mayflower's.
I would sleep here with my wife, my family.
Right,
whatever.
right. Yeah. As we talked about, Mayflower was a very crowded ship during that crossing, and people were sleeping all over the place.
What makes, I know we've heard about Jamestown, we've heard about other settlements, but what makes Plymouth different than those earlier settlements?
Yeah, Plymouth has been fortunate for a lot of reasons. One, the nature of the voyage, the nature of the settling, the plantation. It was designed to be a new colony, a new location, families, farming, permanent settlement, as opposed to Jamestown, which was more of a enterprise. Single men and gentlemen went with their servants and were going to extract goods from the ground, resources from the ground, and make money from the land, whereas Plymouth was there as a permanent settlement.
Now, what is this? This is a piece of machinery. It's made of wood.
This is an important part of the machinery of Mayflower II. It's called a capstan. Ships all through the centuries had different types of capstan. This one actually extends up to the deck above and can be used either on that deck or this deck or both. Bars would be slid through these square holes, and the sailors can walk around and make the capstan spin around. From this deck, you could put a line around it and run it out through the stern and maybe pull the ship backwards along a wharf or up to an anchor or something like that. From the deck above, it's used to help raise sails, raise the cargo out of the hold.
So this is a pulley system,
A kind of a winch.
Yep. And what this does is provide the torque to pull the lines.
Yep, exactly.
So now we're moving towards the bow of the middle deck, and again, this is living space for our 102 individuals on the vessel.
That's right. The passengers, as I mentioned, were living anywhere they could. This stairway that we have here is, of course, a modern convenience for our visitors who come to see us all during the season. And forward of that is a windlass, a 17th century windlass used to raise the anchor on Mayflower when we're underway. Also up forward in the 17th century probably is where the animals lived. There was a space called a manger, which is a series of boards used to collect the debris that comes in the anchor, and that was probably the space where the goats or pigs and chickens lived.
Now, Peter, we're below deck, and this is the lower deck now. And again, can you tell us what the purpose of this deck was? And then also, I know you indicated that this particular area here is extremely important for the ship.
Yeah, this is the hold, the lowest deck on Mayflower. And of course, if we were in the water, we'd be underwater right now. And this is the space where all the supplies for the ship are kept. All the food for the crew, extra sails perhaps, cordage, water, beer, anything that supplies would have been down in this space. Probably nobody living down here. It was probably chock-a-block full of barrels and crates and everything, along with goods that the passengers needed to start their colony in Plymouth.
So if we had a problem out at sea, we're not going to call anyone. We need to take care of it ourselves.
Sure.
So there would be, in essence, the ship carpenters, all the different equipment that we would need.
That's right.
To repair our vessel.
That's right. The ship had to be able to take care of itself for at least a year. They had supplies and provisions. They knew they were going to sail out and back, and had probably a year's worth of food and material and supplies to make that crossing.
So completely self-sufficient.
As much as they could be.
Did they do any fishing as they went?
Probably not, for a couple of reasons. It was a very stormy crossing, so not very safe to be on deck. And also in the deep water, they just were not probably fishing.
And didn't have the sophistication that we have today.
Right, that's right.
Now what is this this hole here? That
this is the very bottom of the ship. This is the bilge where the water collects and is pumped out over the side, similar to the 17th century, where they would have log pumps that would be fit into the bottom of the ship, and the carpenter and his crew would keep track of how much water was leaking into the ship every day and try to keep it pumped out.
And what, they'd have a baffle that they would...
That's right, a sort of a leather flapper, and inside was a lifting mechanism that lifted the water up through the pipe and spilled it over the side.
All right, now, then the other thing here is you have the plate to seat the mast.
Currently, our main mast is out of the ship. It's we're doing some repair to it, but the space that it goes into is in that center cage there. The main mast is about 55 feet long from the keel all the way up to the top of it. Then there's another mast that goes above that. The timber is Douglas fir, approximately 2 feet in diameter.
And how high?
Around 55 feet.
So 5 stories high.
Right.
Now, the other interesting thing is I see there's outlines there for barrels. So they actually stored barrels in a horizontal position.
Yeah, barrels were stacked down below. Barrels was a common way of storing both wet goods and dry goods. Of course, beer and water would have been stored in barrels, but things that they wanted to keep dry could also be stored in a barrel to keep the water from getting on them.
This is a vessel, a sailing vessel, a boat. And for some reason, we have it filled with rocks. Can you explain that? Why we're carrying rocks in the bottom of the boat?
It's about balance, and it's about buoyancy. Mayflower is a very large ship, 256 tons, but 133 of those tons are ballast, and all that does is keep the ship upright in the water. If you go out and look at the ship from the side, and look at the big mass and think about the sails and the wind pushing that ship over, you have to have something on the other end to keep it from rolling right over.
Right, and in this case, it was cobblestones.
Right, that's a modern thing, the cobblestones for our reproduction ship. In the 17th century, it was probably a lot of sand or shale, stones. Interestingly, in the inventory of Mayflower in 1624, some of the things that were noted were shovels, and you wouldn't think shovels on a ship doesn't make a lot of sense until you start thinking about the ballast. And when they're loading cargo, they might have more cargo on one side or higher or lower. And they'd have to shovel that ballast to different parts of the ship to keep the ship balanced.
To keep it on an even keel.
Exactly.
Which is very interesting. And the whole idea is before you set sail, as your vessel is sitting in the water, you want an even keel. You want it to be perpendicular to the water.
Right.
Then as you begin to pick up speed, as you begin to pick up wind, you will list to either side.
That's right. But the ballast will help keep you from going too much.
Now we're above decks, but we're also in an enclosed area. What is this space?
Well, this is actually one of the nicest cabins on Mayflower. It's called the Great Cabin. It's where Master Jones would have lived. Master Jones was both quarter owner of the vessel and also in charge of the ship, the master of the vessel. So he had the nicest cabin. He probably lived here alone, might have shared it with one of the mates or two of the mates. We don't know. But this was his space where he lived.
And this is a large space, light, airy, nice space.
It follows the classic structure of hierarchy at sea. The master lives aft on the ship, and the common sailors live forward, all clumped together in a little space, dark and smelly and smoky. The back of the ship is generally a calmer, safer place to be. The front of the ship is always going up and down and breaking the waves, whereas the back part of the ship takes advantage of that smoother water.
Now, I've got my hands on here on the whip staff, and we just saw the mechanism of it below on the middle deck. But explain exactly what this is.
Sure. This is the way the ship is steered. It's essentially an extension of the tiller, and it allows the helmsman who's standing in the steerage cabin here to move the tiller back and forth while standing in a relatively secure place. The helmsman has a binnacle, a wooden box with some compasses in it that he can look at to steer by. And there's also a hatch here that the master who's standing, or a navigator perhaps, standing up on this deck above, would call down and tell him to steer one way or the other, or give him a compass course. But it's the mechanism by which the ship is steered.
Compass is right here?
Right. There's a wooden box and the two doors that have compasses in them.
Okay. And that's your high tech navigation, right? Celestial navigation.
It's part of the navigation process. There's a cross staff, which is a simple device used to measure the angle of the object above the horizon, from which you can get your latitude, where you are, north and south. Another navigational tool is a chip log, which is used to determine the speed at which you're traveling. And of course, the compass will give you your course. So the three things, a location, a course, and a speed, will help you determine where you are. This is a scuttle hatch, a hatch that the crew or passengers would use to come up or down. As we mentioned, the stairway that we have is a modern convenience for our passengers, for our visitors.
So the helmsman knows who's coming and going anyway.
Right. And this is a cabin that people are living in. This is a steerage cabin that some middle-level officers would be living in. There'd probably be beds on both sides here, small cabins. And so this was an active cabin. People were coming and going all the time.
I see. And also the vessel is underway 24 hours a day.
Right.
So someone is always on
probably
watch.
Always somebody on the helm. Yep.
Very good. So we've inserted the wooden lever into the capstan, which, as you explained before, Peter, is the equivalent of a winch.
Right.
And how many crew members would be involved in turning this?
Well, there's two sets of bars that the sailors can push on. So there's at least one on each side here and one on each side there. So that's 4. And there could be 4 below. But then you could double up any one of those. So you could have 16.
Very good.
16 people pushing around. And then lines would be led from the Knight's Head back aft here to this, either a halyard, which would raise a sail, or a yard, or a cargo tackle to get goods out of the hold.
Very interesting. And again, all by manpower.
Simple manipulation of the capstan.
Being up on the deck now, I get the real understanding as to why, in spite of how cold it was below, the Pilgrims would have wanted to stay below, because it's not a heck of a lot warmer up here, even in the sun.
No, it's not very pleasant. You can imagine mid-ocean, very cold, always wet, waves washing aboard. It's not very safe either.
Yes, no, you can see that it could easily be swept ashore.
There's a story of John Howland, who was tossed over the side of the ship during a storm. It was only saved by grabbing hold of a line that was trailing.
Was very lucky.
So very lucky.
That's 1 in a million.
Right, that he could have very easily been lost.
And they hauled him back on.
Yeah, he was brought back aboard, held the halyard in his hand, and they used a boat hook, they say, to kind of hook him and bring him back on.
Tell us what this is and what it was for.
This is the forward cabin on the ship, or the forecastle. It's a place where the common sailors lived during the 1620 crossing. As I mentioned, there were 25 or 30 crew in total, but not all of them were common sailors. Some were officers and lived in the steerage cabin, or Master Jones in the great cabin. But there were probably, could have been as many as 15 or so men living in this cabin. Pretty small space, but it was the typical lot of a common sailor to have pretty uncomfortable conditions.
Yes, and what else took place in this?
It's also the cook room. It's the place where food was prepared for the crew and probably the passengers as well. The hearth that we have in there is a copy of one that was on the Mary Rose that sunk in the 1500s, recovered in the 1970s, and we have some archaeological drawings that help us design that hearth.
And basically what it was a brick oven.
Yeah, there was a brass kettle on top, and so water could be boiled. A lot of food. A common meal was pottage, boiled oats or rice with either fish or flesh or peas, all boiled together.
Peter, we're quite up above the waterline now, and what part of the ship are we on?
This is called the command deck, or the half deck. It's the deck that the officers would use to control the ship, command the ship. The master or navigator could stand. This is the hatch below which is the whipstaff, so he can communicate to the helmsman from here, and the master or the officer of the watch can see everything that's going on the ship from this location.
Yeah, this is a great vantage point. Now, what is this cabin back here?
This is the last cabin in the stern, called the roundhouse.
The roundhouse.
It's sort of an office, essentially. The best way to think about it is a place where they carried out their navigation. They might use their cross staff to get a fix, and then they would work out where they were on a chart in the roundhouse. Probably because it was so crowded in 1620 that some of the mates might have been living in that space.
Now, let's talk about the passengers themselves. For a better life, they came to the New World.
Many of them, one of the misconceptions that people have is that the passengers were all religious zealots who were coming to the New World to practice their religion for religious freedom. That is not essentially true. A percentage of the passengers were coming to separate themselves from the Church of England and to be able to practice their religion the way they wanted to. But many of the passengers came for economic opportunity. There was unlimited land here. There was unlimited opportunity for a person who could work hard and make something of their life. And that sparked an interest in people regardless of their religious background.
And then they had a tremendous amount of help from the Native Americans who were here. Again, can you explain how that all came about?
Sure. in southeastern Massachusetts, Cape Cod in particular, there had been prior contact with Europeans. The natives had prior contact, and a lot of the times it was not a positive interaction. There were examples of kidnappings, Europeans stealing and kidnapping natives and taking them back to England. There had been plagues brought to the New World unintentionally by Europeans, and whole settlements. For example, Patuxet, the native settlement, which is now Plymouth, was completely wiped out by plague brought by, or smallpox brought by Europeans. So the reaction, the interaction with natives in English were mixed at best. When the English arrived in 1620, they very quickly realized they needed the help of the natives, and the natives realized the advantage to having friends, English as friends with their gunpowder and their weapons to protect them from other warring native tribes. So very quickly, the English and the natives realized they could use each other, could help each other, and for a number of years, they coexisted to each other's benefit.
It's a wholesome, positive, optimistic story about people working together and coexisting.
It can be, and as you alluded to, the early part of that relationship was the most profitable, the most cooperative aspect of the relationship. They certainly were beneficial for each other for many years early on, until later on when the press for land and other pressures caused the difficulties between the two sides.
How long was it before that began to?
I want to say in the 1670s.
So 50 years or so.
Right.
And then you began this push where we violated the native lands, right, and different traditions, which is not a happy
King Philip's War.
Which is not a happy or positive story for the
but
English.
An important story to learn, as we should learn from all our past, all our mistakes, right, and hopefully do better in the future.
And no visit to any ship would be complete without going on the poop deck, right?
No, not at all.
So let's go up
Sure.
there, okay? So Peter, we're here now on the poop deck, and obviously we're high above the main deck, and the ship actually looks like, from a proportion to the forecastle deck, it's almost like a sleigh ride down.
That's right. Well, that's one of the unique features of a 17th century ship. This very high stern castle and much lower forward castle lets the ship act like a weather vane. When there are no sails on the ship will naturally point up into the wind, which is one of the safest ways to ride. When they came over in 1957, they went through a storm off of Bermuda, and they took all the sails off, and the crew and Alan Villiers, the captain, quickly realized the ingeniousness of having a design like this, is having that high stern and the ship naturally pointing up into the wind, and then the ship will ride safely up and down over the waves.
I see. Now, the other thing that's interesting is how high above the waterline are we?
We're probably 25 feet or so off the water right now where we are, and this is a great vantage point. In the 17th century, the navigator could come up here with his cross staff and see clear to the horizon without sails or rigging in the way, and determine their location.
Now, and you still would have a higher vantage point if you went up into the crow's nest.
Right, up into the working tops. That's, of course, much higher, but the sails are in front of those many times, so it's a limited view.
Very good. So we really appreciate you showing us around the Mayflower, and I can tell you that this will be every young boy or girl in our city. Imagination will be captured by just this tremendous voyage that was taken against all odds, really. But I want to thank you very much. You did a great job.
Happy to do it.
It is fascinating. the extremes that people would go to in order to make the changes that they feel are necessary to do. And they did. That's kind of it's an interesting interesting grouping of people. It wasn't just all pilgrims moving for religious purposes. There's a lot of folks on there, also looking at it from the entrepreneurial side of it. You remember there had been Europeans in the in America for some period of time before then too. And then, well, expansion. Well, man, that definitely is an uglier story, as was alluded to, over here. So, but it's part of the story. Everything is part of the story. I guess the big question is, will we ever learn? Will we, when I mean we, as a total civilization, ever learn that there are people that move from one place to another, that migrate for whatever reasons, that are looking to get out of different areas for various reasons, whether it be from an entrepreneurial standpoint or from a freedom standpoint or for just creating a better life. Everything is got an impact on everything else, right? We do not act alone. We do not act alone. So maybe this Thanksgiving we should do something that would be very appropriate to not acting alone, is help somebody out somewhere along the line. Make that work. Don't worry about the shopping and all the rest of that stuff, but help somebody out somewhere today and make that happen. That's a good way to speak well, speak often, and live inspired.